The 1939 movie that we're going to talk about today predicts what we see now in Congress and in the government, all of the corruption. Welcome to the Weekend Spectator, Paul Kengor. It's great to be with you. My name is Grace Reilly, and we're excited to go over this movie today and talk about all of the modern implications.
Great and gracious Grace. Good to be with you again.
It's so good to be with you. Today, we're going to be breaking down Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, of course, released by Frank Capra, and it's extremely insightful because of the commentary that it is on the government. And at the time that it was released back in 1939, this was kind of revolutionary to be calling out corruption in the government, but obviously, people have no problem doing that today. So the Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College decided to take this movie and take those questions of the corruption in the government and what the role of government should be today, how this applies to modern times with things like the new Make America Healthy Again movement or DOGE with Elon Musk or Donald Trump. And Paul Kengor is going to provide a lot of insight into that and connect the two, since he was obviously in charge of and at the conference at Grove City College this past week.
Yeah, that's right. So we did this conference called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington 2025. By the way, Grace, we came up with this idea before Donald Trump won the election in November. So we realized that you need, the whole theme of Mr. Smith was to go to Washington, stop corruption, stop waste, stop abuse, right? Get back to simpler times where government was supposed to be. Quite interestingly, the whole theme of Mr. Smith, when Jefferson Smith, this senator from, interestingly, they never say in the movie where he's from. All right. But Frank Capra talked in his biography where they got the idea, the original book. He's actually a senator from Montana. But they didn't want to identify exactly where the senator was. It kind of assumed that he's from the heartland. But he's this kind of folksy Abraham Lincoln type, this guy who loves the founders, really loves Lincoln, loves Jefferson. Jefferson Smith wants to get back to what they're all about. The bill that he proposes in Congress is to build this boys' camp on what's called Willett Creek back in his home state. And get this, Grace, the whole plan is that the boys will get a loan from the federal government in order to build this boys' camp, and then all of the money will be paid back by money that the boys will raise. All right. Now, would they even think of doing that today? Right. I mean, today it'd be like, where's the government to give us our money, to give us our subsidy? Right. The complete opposite. In fact, you would just have the Democrats, actually, to have the Democrats, the creek would have to have some sort of hook, I'm sure, to transgenderism or something, right? In order to find a way to dole out the money, to have some sort of a link to whatever. You'd have to have some sort of like ideological identification for the Democrats. But the whole thing of Mr. Smith is they would pay back the money. They would actually pay it back. So we did a conference on this, thinking we need reform and everything else to come to Washington. Then lo and behold, Donald Trump wins in 2024. And now this is like reform on steroids. You got a Doge with Elon Musk. You got
Everything
RFK
upside
Jr.
down.
What's
Every
that?
Turning everything upside down.
Everything upside down, everything from DOE to DEI, USAID, going after all these different agencies, Department of Education, you name it. So our Jefferson Smith isn't supposed to be Donald Trump, right? I mean, the Jimmy Stewart character and Donald Trump have nothing in common. But this idea of reform and abuse and corruption needing reformed, I mean, that's probably more important in 2025
I think
than it
too.
is in 1939.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think too, like another parallel could be the fact that so he's an idealistic senator that came in kind of with more rose-colored glasses and then it was exposed to DC's corruption and tried to make a difference there. Trump obviously isn't from politics. He got into politics with purely that goal. He wasn't someone who was embedded in all the corruption ahead of time.
Right.
He wasn't involved in government or DC before. He's someone who came from the outside to try to weed out the corruption from within.
It's a good point because when the case of Jefferson Smith, so the whole setting is they have this guy who's known as the Silver Knight. He's like the senior senator from the state, and then the junior senator from the state unexpectedly dies, so they have to replace him. And the governor is immediately influenced by Boss Taylor, who's like the boss party machine guy, and they try to replace him with with what the governor's kids in a really funny moment where they're at the dinner table harassing their father. They said, oh, come on, Pop, don't replace him with a trained SEAL from Boss Taylor. Pick a real guy, pick somebody real. And they suggest Jefferson Smith,
And
who's
also,
like a
was it
local.
someone who wasn't going to rock the boat too?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. They wanted somebody who would go and just listen and do what he was told, do what he was told by the party machine, by Boss Taylor, by the senior senator. They didn't want someone who was going to be his own man. And the kids
They got it.
suggest Jefferson Smith. Yeah, so they get a guy who is not only his own man, but is just totally sincere. In a really stirring kind of moving moment at the start of the film. When he first goes to Washington, he immediately disappears from the train station and goes on this like bus tour of the different spots in DC. And he gets there to the Lincoln Memorial, and he's watching this little kid recite and read the words of the Gettysburg Address to his grandfather. And Jefferson Smith is watching that. Really cool. Where that scene came from. When Frank Capra first got to Washington to do some of the research and get ready to make the film, he got in the cab and went to the Lincoln Memorial. And while he was there looking at Lincoln, he saw a little kid reading the words of the Gettysburg Address to his grandfather. And Frank Capra said, that scene is going in the movie. So it
Why?
becomes, yeah. And Capra himself was a conservative Republican. So he very much identified with the party of Lincoln. And he hated what FDR was doing. This is 1939. And a number of times in Capra's biography, in fact, I've got it right here.
Oh, good. And we,
But
just for context, everyone, we talk about a lot. Both Paul and I love old movies. So, of course, Capra is one of the greats when it comes to that and is behind so many huge movies.
yeah, and before we get to that, one of the things that Capra says about FDR, Capra hated the tax rates. Okay. So this guy is a total rags to riches story, comes to America from Sicily, 1903, May, June 1903, on this boat with his family. Takes forever to get across the Atlantic. I mean, he and his family, people are vomiting, they're sick, they think they're going to die, terrorized immigrants. They get to Ellis Island, they're there forever. They take the train like all the way across to California. They get there, they're lucky to be alive by the time they get there. So he goes from this penniless immigrant to, by the late 1930s, being basically the top filmmaker in all of Hollywood. And in his memoirs, a number of times, he will say, well, now for this film, I made $240,000. However, because I was in the upper income tax rate of the Roosevelt administration, I paid blank number of dollars in income taxes. He was the second highest income tax person in all of Hollywood behind Louis B. Mayer. So he would lose literally 90% of his income in income taxes. So one of the things that made Capra, like eventually Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican who hated taxes. But in the movie Mr. Smith, he tries to avoid anything real partisan like that, but he does generally focus on graft, corruption. And one of the best parts of the film, which we showed at Grove City College, I put up on the big screen during the presentation, he also shows how dishonest the media is in DC and how power hungry they are. He portrays them as a number of times as a bunch of drunks. And when the movie came out and was premiered in DC, Frank Capra was there and at the National Press Club in a booth with his wife, and they had just screened the film. Everybody in Washington was all excited to see it. And then once the press reporters saw it, they came after Frank Capra and his wife Lou like a pack of hounds, yelling at him about being portrayed as a bunch of drunks. As Capra puts it, with martinis in their hands, drunk, yelling at me about being portrayed as a bunch of drunks. And he says, one reporter comes, he said, in a scene that Capra would even dare put into a movie, it was so unbelievable. He's so staggering drunk, he starts cursing, yelling, where's that punk? Where's that SOB? Where's all these names? And he comes over to the table with Capra and his wife, and he takes this wild swing at Capra and falls flat onto the table. Glasses go flying up in the air. Capra and his wife bolt out of the table and literally run to the Willard Hotel, as he said, like fugitives trying to escape the whole scene.
Wow.
But so part of Capra's point in the late 1930s, like today, the media was corrupt. The media was corrupt,
Mhm.
and we certainly see that the media in Washington, D.C. is often as corrupt and as power hungry as the politicians.
Oh my gosh, so, so true. And that definitely ties into what we see today, as you're explaining. And I was going to say before that scene you were talking about the Lincoln Memorial, the Gettysburg Address, and that young boy, why does that feel nostalgic? It shouldn't,
I
because
know,
I
I
wish
know.
that that type of patriotism was more normal, but it can't help but feel nostalgic to think about such a nice story like that.
I
Because
had there was a conference attendee at Grove City College. She came up to me at the end of the talk and she had tears in her eyes. And
Mhm.
she said that scene of the Lincoln Memorial, she said exactly what you just said, Grace. She said, I feel like I need to go back to DC and do a Mr. Smith tour like he did and go to the Lincoln Memorial. I felt the same way. I've now been to DC hundreds of times. And I feel like I should just go there on a nice day and go in and just walk into the Lincoln Memorial and read those words. And to see that, people watching that film, I could just actually New Yorker, New York Times, some of these other people, they were this cynical about It's a Wonderful Life, another Capra film, right? But I could see people saying, ah, come on, little kid reading Gettysburg Address to his grandpa. Come on, kind of stuff doesn't really happen. But Frank Capra got there, turns around, there's a little kid reading the words to his grandfather. His grandfather's tearing up. And Capra says, wow, we're putting that scene in the movie. I could picture that happening at the Lincoln Memorial. And an added touch by Capra, he shows a black man in the background. And I don't know if he saw that himself or not, but he puts this in the movie. And the black man like takes his hat off and he's like, paying homage here to Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves.
wow, that's incredible. And so from the conference, it's really cool to hear some of those stories about what attendees thought about just the overall topic in the film, but other questions that were the goal of discussion and the center of discussion at the conference related to what the powers of the government should be, what the role of the government should be, how current events, so things like Elon Musk and DOGE or RFK, how those kind of compare to that when looking through the lens of this 1939 movie. What were some of the messages that came out about that through the conference?
We had Mark Thiessen of the Washington Post, who was a former President George W. Bush speechwriter, wrote speeches for Donald Rumsfeld. And Grace, he gave one of the best talks I've ever heard. I mean, it was really good for about an
Hopefully that
hour.
should be posted online at some point,
It,
correct?
it should, it should. And he went through some of the numbers and the things that he was reporting from what DOGE has found and other organizations already on the amount of money that was spent just in the last couple of years in Washington, where literally no one knows where it even went. I mean, it was just like vanished. I mean, the bureaucracy is so bad and so big that they're just spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars that go unaccounted for. And if that's not something that needs reformed, right? I mean, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And that's an example of just abusive government getting far removed from the vision of the founders, from a proper balance between state, local government, and the federal government. And that's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 2025 right there. Maybe it's Mr. Musk goes to Washington in 2025.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are so many. It shouldn't be partisan with what Doge is finding because everyone, no matter what side you're on, should be outraged at the amount of waste that happens in our government. And that should be something that unites everyone. But of course, as we know, it's not, which is pretty fascinating and has been dependent like with everything that they've come across and found.
I mean, this is really something that everybody in America ought to be able to unify around. But in the case of a lot of the liberals and Democrats, instead, what are they doing to Elon Musk? Throwing rocks through Teslas, right? Ramming into them in carts, right? Vandalizing products that he sells. I mean, they ought to be giving this guy a Presidential Medal of Freedom
Yeah.
for finding ways that, and by the way, liberals, you guys love government, right? Well, if you want people to back your love of government and to go to your party again as the party of government, why don't you make government accountable,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And then that way people will feel confident giving more of their tax money to the government. But right now, as long as your government is this corrupt and abusive, they're not going to want to support you guys. So
Well,
you ought to support his efforts to reform it and make it better.
absolutely. And that's one of the things I like about the topic that you all chose to discuss in this conference. It's bringing back these basic questions of what should the role of government be? A question that simple that's been forgotten by so many.
Right. And if they had any idea of how much money is truly being wasted, right, they'd be shocked. And remember when Musk and Trump first came in, and what did they say? They asked for all federal workers to give a list of like 5 things that they had done that week.
Yeah,
And I'm
it was
sure a lot
outrage.
of,
They couldn't do
yeah,
it.
right, right. And a lot of federal workers probably thought, how dare you ask us to do that? But most people are like, I have to report to my boss every day all the things that I have to do, right?
I do.
This is common sense stuff. Yeah, exactly. So I think, again, these are things that people ought to be able to unify around, as they did with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And by the way, what could be more unifying, right, than a Capra movie generally, right? That guy goes from giving us Mr. Smith in 1939, which had Jimmy Stewart, right? Jimmy Stewart, Jean Arthur. And at that point, I think it was the second movie he made with Jimmy Stewart and Jimmy Arthur. He did You Can't Take It With You with the two of them the year before, which is
Yeah.
really a great movie. That's
And
a
of
lot of
course,
fun.
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life comes in 1946. So the gap there, that 7 year gap, World War II, right? 1939 to 45. And Jimmy Stewart isn't available to make movies during part of that period because he's off flying bombing missions over Europe. And I mean, real heroic World War II service. And then he comes back at the end of World War II and lives to go on to make what Capra considered his greatest movie ever. And I agree with that.
Many
It's a
agree.
Wonderful Life. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Capra, I mean, he played a role in just delivering such important, uplifting messages centered around wonderful values. And It's a Wonderful Life is the perfect example of that. And is obviously has remained a timeless classic that many would say is their favorite Christmas movie. And in this movie too, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We hope that you consider checking it out after this conversation because obviously, again, I think it's fascinating to watch things that are so old that can so accurately predict human nature and the problems that still exist. Uh,
It
that we
really is that, isn't it? It's a statement on human nature. And in fact, maybe you could put up on the screen. I did a Christmas piece for American Spectator back a few months ago, calling "It's a Wonderful Life" the greatest movie ever made. And Capra, who was a really humble guy, I mean, he came from incredibly humble roots. He even said, "I think it's not only the best movie I ever made, I think it's the greatest movie ever." Right? That's quite a statement for someone to say about their own film. But he wrote it, and I give a long quote in the article about who he wrote it for. And it's for all those people out there, he said, from that spinster who never gets married, that old man in the nursing home, those people behind the Iron Curtain, right? All the forgotten people of the world, who his message to them is, we care about you, you're loved, and no one is a failure as long as they have friends,
Yeah.
which is the message of It's a Wonderful Life, and really of a lot of Capra movies. And Capra in his autobiography, Michael Medved, who spoke at our conference, quoted from it. By the late 1960s, Grace, he was so disgusted at where Hollywood was going with, and he used a lot of descriptions about promiscuity, different sexual lifestyles, and everything else, how dark movies were becoming. This is a guy who came from really dark circumstances. He wanted movies to be uplifting. I mean, you could make movies about that, about those other things, right? But he wanted movies to uplift the country, uplift people, and give them values to aspire to, rather than to turn people away from.
Yeah, and what a lack there is of that today. And I can't help but think too. I mean, if we think about the most classic movies, the best of all time, my personal favorite movie is The Sound of Music. It's another,
Yeah, right, right.
obviously not Capra, but the movies that he created were centered around values and uplifting.
Often a criticism from critics on the left at the time in Capra's lifetime is that these movies were sentimental, kind of Norman Rockwell-ish, right? By the way, I love Norman Rockwell. There's nothing wrong with Norman Rockwell. But in all of these movies, I mean, they have so many dark night of the soul moments with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where Jefferson Smith goes back to the Lincoln Memorial a second time, and he's like crying there and he's wiped out. The key moment in It's a Wonderful Life is when George Bailey's about to jump off a bridge, right, and kill himself. That whole movie begins with a prayer that's going up to the heavens, which is what brings down literally right from the heavens Clarence the guardian angel. Meet John Doe, which is one of my favorites with Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck. The end of the movie, he's up on a skyscraper, getting ready to jump off and kill himself. So they have these dark moments. They're not all sugar coated, but in the end, they often have happy endings because they're about redemption. They're about doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find these recordings from the conference? If I'm correct from my time at Grove City, they should be posted on IFF's YouTube or something at some point.
Yeah.
But give people more information about how where they can look into all of this more.
Yeah. So our website is faithandfreedom.com, and we probably will posted pretty quickly. If you go there, just look around the website. I think it pops right up. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington 2025. And by the time that we post this, will those videos be posted? I'm not sure, but we could post them on here once we have them.
Yeah, and just keep, and even if they're not up yet, just keep your eye on faithandfreedom.com and the Faith and Freedom YouTube, and you can find all of the past conference clips there. There's been a lot of good topics over the years. You can find the work of the student fellows on both the website and the YouTube page and all other social media platforms. So it's worth checking out too, especially if you want to see what the younger generation is doing for conservatism and promoting the values for faith and freedom. The Institute for Faith and Freedom was absolutely instrumental in my success and in helping me get to where I am today. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to the great Paul Kengor if I hadn't been able to grow as a student fellow at Grove City College and
Well,
gotten.
you were a natural. You were a natural.
Well,
And you
thank
spent
you.
many times in this room interviewing
I did. I
people.
was in the same room, but I got all of those opportunities to do such great interviews because of the Institute for Faith and Freedom and Grove City College and you. So thank you for that. But really, I can't stress enough how valuable it is to support them. Check out what the current student fellows are doing because they do have such an impact, and I'm an example of that.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's right on. And they should also, if they could, support our Young Writers program at American Spectator. And
Yes,
so,
that's
in
another
fact,
thing yep.
yeah,
And
we,
that's the other thing. I interned with the American Spectator and was one of the young journalists and still am, I guess. But that's another thing. Both the American Spectator and the Institute for Faith and Freedom, like,
yeah, we have one of our benefactors from the Institute for Faith and Freedom who followed you to American Spectator, and he and she, husband and wife, and they support you to this day. And so yeah, all of this works together, and here we are, two people born long after 1939, right? And the year my dad was born, of all. Right. And keeping alive this message that America in 2025 needs today.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this week. Make sure to check out everything we've mentioned, but of course, to go to spectator.org to read more of the reporting and commentary at the American Spectator. It was a pleasure to have you with us this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Grazie, Grace. See you next week.